Hey there, this is Rebecca Koffler with Censored But Not Silenced. I'm going to give you an intelligence brief on the recent summit between the US President Donald J. Trump and the Russian President Vladimir Putin, which took place on Friday, August 15th in Anchorage, Alaska. I will break it down, my assessment of who won, who lost, and what the next steps will likely be. First, as we say, the bluff in the intelligence business, bottom line up front. My assessment is that Putin and the Russian team have won, while President Trump and the US team have lost. This is due to thorough preparation on the Russian side, lack of preparation and lack of expertise of the US side, and unachievable goals that were self-inflicted by the US side. Now I'll give you the details. Why do I assess that the Russians won and the American side lost? This is actually, if you measure by the goals that were set for the meeting by the Russian side and by the US side. First, I'm going to address the Russian side and Putin. Putin's goal originally to go to Alaska were the following. I'll give you three top goals, just to keep it short and sweet. His big overarching goal is not a peace deal in Ukraine at all. It's to repair the US-Russia relations, to set it on a positive footing, to undo everything that took place during former President Biden's presidency, and basically renew a business-like, transactional-like relationship without all the Russians perceived lecturing from the US side on morals, on democracy, on human rights, this and that. Putin's second goal was to change the optics, or rather to put forward the optics to the rest of the world favorable to Russia. He wanted to appear right next to the US President Donald Trump, the leader of the free world. The reason for that is Putin wanted to dispel the narrative that the West has tried to create, that Russia was isolated, that Putin is a pariah, he's a killer, he's not welcome anywhere. Well, Putin wanted to make sure that the rest of the world sees that not only Russia is not isolated, President Trump himself and the United States, the top dog geopolitically, are hosting Putin in Alaska. And then his final goal was Putin's goal, that is, to delay the negative consequences that President Trump had threatened him prior to the meetings. Remember that President Trump was issuing an ultimatum after an ultimatum, 50 days, 10 days. He's going to, within 2 minutes, he's going to find out whether a deal was achievable or not. Well, none of that happened. There's no sanctions. There's nothing at the end of this meeting. So that by all of these three parameters, repair the relations, appear next to U.S. leader for the optics to demonstrate that Russia is an equal to the U.S., and delay the negative consequences, such as sanctions or whatever kind of hurt that the U.S. team has in store for Putin, by these parameters, Putin has won because he has achieved his goal. On the first issue, the relationship, even though they were not completely repaired, obviously, it's impossible to do in one day. But the fact that Trump has effectively agreed to Putin's framework, he changed his stance. Originally, he wanted a quick ceasefire. He threatened severe consequences to Putin if Putin doesn't agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine immediately, quickly, and he switched his goal to actually reach the full peace deal. So Putin was able to convince Trump to shape Trump's whole posture on this conflict towards his preferred approach. So again, by these parameters, the Russians won. How did the US lose? President Trump placed before himself a goal that is, in my intelligence assessment, and I've said it for the past 3.5 years since this war started, that the goal of achieving peace in Ukraine, especially ceasefire, is unachievable. And Trump, that's what Trump wanted to achieve quickly. He said he's going to do it within minutes. If not, they're going to walk away. None of that happened. In fact, nothing happened. It's a nothing burger. And it's not a criticism necessarily of President Trump. It's just a statement based on their own self-inflicted, unachievable goals, the team. Here's my assessment why the US team lost. And I find no pleasure and no comfort saying that. But as an intelligence officer, my job is to tell you the truth. And in fact, one of the reasons that the US team keeps letting themselves be strung along by Putin is because they don't treat their adversary seriously. They don't understand Putin. They haven't done their homework. So, and another reason is that no one tells the truth virtually on legacy media. They just it's, we're going to achieve peace. Ukraine is winning. Russians are idiots. Putin is a killer. The Russians don't know how to fight. Like all of this stuff. They convince themselves and the American people who are watching this legacy media that it's a slam dunk. It's as what's his face? The director, George Tenet, the director of CIA. Remember that slam dunk, the weapons, the WMD in Iraq, right? What disaster that was. So a country was invaded based on false intelligence. So here's my assessment of why the US team lost. There was not a single person on Trump's team who truly understands Putin, his psyche, his worldview, how his intelligence tradecraft, how he operates, how he thinks. Not a single person. No one understands Russia, Russian warfighting strategy, Russian history. Not a single person. And I'm not saying that the team was a bad team. Trump brought heavy hitters to the meeting. There was Steve Witkoff. There was, although I wouldn't call him necessarily a heavy hitter, but you got to give it to the guy who's been racking up airline miles, shuttling back and forth to Moscow, risking his life, in my view, just just to come back with nothing. So that's dedication and courage right there. But on a more serious note, so Trump had Rubio, he had Secretary of State, obviously, Marco Rubio, he had Pete Hegseth, he had Susie Wiles, he had Scott Bessent. These are all good people, competent people, but none of them have the in-depth expertise on their opponent. They haven't done their homework. So they came in, it's not clear what the plan was. What was the plan? What was the plan? Putin, on the other hand, had 3 people on his team with deep level of understanding of America, American culture, how we think, how we fight, how our society works, how it's polarized. These 3 speak near native level English, minus the accent, of course. Who I'm talking about? I'm talking about Yuri Ushakov, who is a former ambassador to the United States, spent a decade in the United States. I'm talking about Kirill Dmitriev, the CEO of the Russian Foreign Direct Investment Fund, Harvard graduate, worked on Wall Street, as a large social network inside the United States, and so does Ushakov, for example. Ushakov has been meeting with U.S. journalists during his time serving in the United States as an ambassador. Obviously, all of these interactions, they develop your understanding of the adversary, which is the number one thing that one has to do when engaging in any type of warfare. And yes, don't be mistaken. We are at war with Russia. It's not kinetic at this point, but from the Russian standpoint, we are in a confrontation that's nearing a kinetic phase over control of Ukraine. We're in a proxy war. That's how the Russians view it. That's why they do their homework. And then the third person is Sergei Lavrov. He's a barracuda. The guy is smart. All of these men are smart, including Putin. Putin is highly intelligent. And by the way, Putin himself has a working knowledge of English. Okay? So Lavrov spent decades here in the US as a diplomat, with the exception of Dmitriev. All of these are former intelligence officers. Now, so what does it mean when you don't have somebody on the team who speaks the language of the adversary and understands the adversary? That means that you have no idea what the red lines are, when they talk amongst each other, the Russians, in an unofficial setting. I'm not talking about at the table where there are interpreters. I'm talking about standing in line for coffee, mingling around in the cafeteria, going to the bathroom, anywhere. The Americans could not possibly glean into the inside thinking of what the Russians think about the meeting, what they think, how the meeting is going. Do they think they're winning? Do they think they're losing? The only thing Americans could rely on is body language. Well, that can be helpful, but the Russians, in other words, they were at a significant advantage, understanding their opponent and actually having done their homework. And I want to bring it to your attention. This book, hopefully most of you have read, and if not, I highly recommend. Even if you're a layperson, even if you have don't deal with intelligence or with military operations or anything, you should still, even if you're a business person or a regular lay person, this book is tremendous. It's by Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese strategist, and it's called The Art of War. And it's actually a fun, it's an extremely important book that, by the way, is taught at the Russian General Staff. The Russian General Staff is there's, by the way, there's no direct equivalent of the Russian General Staff in U.S. military. What the Russian General Staff does is war planning. But prior to doing war planning, they actually study the adversary. And this is one of the books that is a mandatory reading, and not just reading, but they review it and they embed these concepts into their war planning, in addition to other works of the top strategists globally, not just the Russians one and the Chinese. They study the British one, the British the father of the asymmetric strategy, the strategy of indirect action, Sir Liddell Hart. That's a renowned British strategist. The Russians study thoroughly, and then they incorporate all of these concepts in their war planning. And so the Russians have done their homework. We haven't. The next reason for why the US team lost is that there's absolutely no trust between the two teams, between Moscow and Washington. And remember, it's not just Trump versus Putin. And yes, there's respect between these two. There's healthy respect. There's no friendship, or, you can't, Putin has no friend. You can't be you can't really be a friend with Putin. I mean, these are, and if you're Trump, both Trump and Putin, they defend their respective countries' interests. But the Russians don't trust us. They just don't trust Americans any more than we trust them. So when we go in and say, oh, let's do a ceasefire, and we're going to, give you all of these incentives, although it's not clear what incentives there are, because that we're willing to give to the Russians. There are some that we could, but that would go counter to our long-standing policy and counter to what was done during the Biden administration as punishment for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. The sanctions, the disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT, kicking out the diplomats, and breaking all military-to-military exchanges, everything, right? So everything. So, but whenever we go in and say, we're going to sign this ceasefire deal, you know what the Russians think? They think we're going to use this time to rearm Ukraine, resupply. Ukraine will take a breather, a pause, a tactical pause. We are able to put in all of the ordnance that we have in the pipeline for them, and Ukraine will resume the fighting. The Russians are not stupid, and that actually, in my assessment, that is likely what the plan is, because the Europeans are they are terrified of Putin, even though they did nothing about that perceived threat. As I personally briefed NATO in 2013, right before, just a few months before Russia's invasion of Crimea laid out. Europeans knew what was coming, and yet they decided they did not beef up their force posture, didn't develop any counter strategy, nothing. So, but the Europeans are terrified of Putin, and they would rather continue the killing of Ukrainians, using them effectively as human shields, delaying this conflict, than stop everything and let things play out, and not prolong the inevitable. So there's no trust. So these are the reasons. What happens next? So President Trump is going to meet with Zelensky and the European leaders. He is somehow under the impression that there's going to be a trilateral meeting between Putin, Trump, and Zelensky. Well, that's not going to happen. And I'll explain to you why it's not going to happen. But this is just to demonstrate to you lack of preparation. Just the fact itself that they think that there's going to be a trilateral meeting demonstrates to me homework has not been done. There's going to be no trilateral meeting. Putin is not going to meet with Zelensky because Zelensky, in Russia's view, is an illegitimate president. Why is he illegitimate? Because his term expired in May. Putin does not meet with illegitimate presidents. He does not view Zelensky as his equal. But more importantly, Putin is an attorney. He understands the Ukrainian constitution probably better than Zelensky does, who is a former actor, a comedian. That's whom Ukrainians elected as a president. So the Russians believe a deal that is signed by an illegitimate president is a poisonous fruit. It can't be enforced. It's not legal because and they are concerned that we can go back on our word that Ukraine and the West, even if we were or there were to be an agreement signed, because it was signed by a person who has no legal right to sign that deal constitutionally. It's not going to be enforceable. It's not going to be a legal deal, so it can be broken. So the only way to avoid this situation is to have elections. But there cannot be any elections because Ukraine is at war. It's under martial law, and the Ukrainian constitution prohibits holding elections in wartime. So Zelensky boxed himself in. The Ukrainians boxed themselves into this situation. So that's why this deal is just simply unachievable. And whatever the bodily gyrations, probably doesn't translate well into English, happens, all these movements and noise and security guarantee, that's another one. Trump says he probably will give security guarantees to Ukraine. Well, what does security guarantee mean? Security guarantee means that you should be willing to enforce if the deal is broken. What does it mean? It means that you have to be willing to place US men and women in uniform and ready to die in Putin's meat grinder, because the Russians are going to violate, highly likely, whatever plan, whatever deal, even if they were to sign it, which they won't. Sending US men and women in uniform to Russia. The second top, or rather the a US equal in terms of nuclear weapons arsenal, and a country that even holds advantage in tactical nukes and overall in the kind of doctrine and strategy in the nuclear realm. This is why Biden was terrified, of and that's why Washington is basically afraid to trip the wire on on Putin and actually go ahead and deploy the forces into the theater in Ukraine because of the threat of Russian escalate to de-escalate nuclear doctrine. So Trump is not going to do that. He promised during his campaign, no more foreign wars. And look, if we couldn't win a war in Afghanistan in 20 years, $2.2 trillion, 6,000 American lives, and we ran away and left $85 billion of top secret equipment. You think we're going to win the war with a nuclear Russia? And in fact, all the wargaming conducted back in the U.S. intelligence community, red won and blue lost. Red being Russia, blue force means U.S. NATO. Dozens and dozens of wargames we conducted. And so the Russians know that's not going to happen. What security guarantees? So these are the reasons. If U.S. side actually wants to win this confrontation and to win it without risking going to nuclear war, it must start doing its homework. It must start doing its homework. There's just no way around it. There's no winging it. There's no easy button. I have somewhere the easy button, because that's kind of like has been the approach thus far. The U.S. military commanders, or rather politicians, the commanders are smarter than that. They understand there needs to be strategy. But the political leaders believe, oh, we're just going to throw enough money and enough weapons at the problem, and the problem's going to go away. Well, when did that happen? When did that happen last time? It hasn't, because weapons and technology and money don't win wars. Strategy does. So, and if you want to learn about Putin, read my book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. I predicted Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2021 when this book was published. And in fact, and I describe Putin's mindset, what shaped his worldview, how the guy thinks, what tricks he uses to outplay his adversary. And he, by the way, outplayed four U.S. presidents: Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Biden. 4 of them. And now it seems like Trump is his next target. And by the way things are going, it looks like Trump's team is just, out of their depth on this. So anyways, and my former agency, DIA, didn't want the Americans to know certain things, and they blacked them out. And specifically what they didn't want to know is the fact that I revealed just one of the things is that instead of focusing the resources and prioritizing the target being Russia, the corrupt intelligence officials under the Obama administration were busy concocting the Russia-Trump collusion hoax. And now all of this is untangling, but I described it in 2021, 4 years before. So that's why DIA, they tried to sabotage my book. But the book describes Putin's strategy at the unclassified level, same that I briefed at highly classified level to NATO, to President Obama's national security staff, to combatant commanders, 4-star generals that head up U.S. Strategic Command that is in charge of our nuclear forces and nuclear weapons, European Command, Northern Command, and NORAD, and Space Forces. So Putin's strategy, just briefly, is there are 5 chapters dedicated to Putin's strategy. Russia organizes for war, Putin's Star Wars, lasers, jammers, satellite killers, cyber weapons, Waging War on U.S. Networks and American Minds, Chapter 6, Spies and Disruptors Infiltrating America, Chapter 7, Active Measures, Subversion, Election, Sabotage, and Assassinations, and Chapter 8, the final chapter, Putin's military option, the things that go bang. So that's the table of content. The book is available on Amazon and at any bookstore that you shop. So let's hope that our team will get serious about the target and put some intellectual firepower on this issue. Otherwise, they're just gonna be outplayed by the Ruskies, because the Ruskies do their homework. Thank you for joining me today. This is Rebecca Koffler with Censored but Not Silence. Follow me on X at Rebecca0132, other social media, YouTube, Facebook, Getter, True Social, Rumble. I'll catch you later. Thank you all.